April, 1943. At 27,000 feet above the occupied skies of France, laughter echoed through the radios of a German squadron. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermischen, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot, squinted through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190. In the distance, a few black dots were laboriously climbing from the horizon. He burst out laughing, his voice dripping with contempt as it crackled through the intercom. "Die armies have sent us flying milk bottles." The Americans and their P-47 Thunderbolts, big, heavy, and as clumsy as flying cows. They called it the flying brick. A biting mockery, and in the eyes of the Germans then, entirely justified. The first Thunderbolts were indeed awkward, heavier than a truck, climbing slowly, turning poorly, and guzzling fuel at a terrifying rate. To the German pilots who ruled Europe's skies with their Foe 190 seconds and Bf 109 seconds, the P-47 was nothing but a joke from across the Atlantic. They laughed, they mocked, and they believed America, the land of those lazy for war, would never understand what a real dogfight was. But then, just 18 months later, that laughter turned into a chilling silence, and the flying brick became the machine that crushed the Luftwaffe. The P-47 was not born out of pride but out of fear. After France fell in 1940, America realized it had no other choice. A monster had to be created not to be beautiful, but to survive. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer, built that monster. A nearly 10-ton hulk of steel with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, powerful enough to hurl it through the sky like a giant bullet. What the Germans called a flying milk cow turned out to be the world's first flying tank. In the early years, many American pilots feared it too large, too fierce, too hard to handle. Today's story isn't just about an airplane. It's about wounded pride. About a nation once mocked as amateurish that rose again through industrial might, willpower, and iron pride. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't born to be beautiful, it was born to answer laughter with thunder. And in less than 2 years, that flying brick rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. Every .50 caliber round it fired rang out like a declaration of freedom. This is not merely the story of a machine. It is the story of how America was mocked and then made the entire sky of Europe fall silent. 1940 Europe was drowning in fire. Paris had fallen. Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe ruled the skies, sweeping away all resistance with terrifying rains of bombs. Across the Atlantic, America still stood on the sidelines, but deep down, everyone knew. The flames of war were closing in. In a small office of Republic Aviation in Long Island, a group of engineers worked through the night, cups of cold coffee beside crumpled blueprints. In an air thick with anxiety, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer with sunken eyes and trembling hands, was sketching what he called a monster that could survive in hell. There was nothing graceful about that design, no beauty, no European refinement, only strength, endurance, and the fear of running out of time. America needed an aircraft that could climb higher, fly farther, and survive longer than anything Germany had. But with the war not yet begun, all they had was a ticking clock. Kartveli couldn't wait for a new engine, couldn't wait for a perfect design. He gathered everything America had, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, and mounted it on a fuselage so massive that no one believed it could even take off. When the XP-47B prototype was unveiled, many laughed. This monster will crash before it leaves the runway. But, in a moment of panic, America didn't need beauty, it needed something that refused to die. The P-47 was born amid the screech of lathes, the smell of oil and welding smoke. Every bolt, every weld was forged out of one haunting question. Will it be ready before Europe collapses? Kartveli didn't know the future. He only knew that if the P-47 failed, thousands of lives would be crushed beneath German bombs. That night, when the first P-47 left the test runway, it didn't merely lift off, it screamed. A deep, brutal sound, unlike any fighter before it. Those who witnessed it stood in silence, No one could tell if it was the sound of triumph or the dying roar of steel and fire. In its early days, the P-47 was a nightmare even for American pilots. They said, "It doesn't fly, it struggles to survive." Dozens died during training, but those who lived, those who tamed the beast, understood. It wasn't built to fly beautifully, but to fly alive. Out of fear, the P-47 Thunderbolt was born as a vow that if war ever reached America, they would not answer it with apologies or elegance, but with a 10-ton fire-breathing machine roaring across the sky. That was the spirit of America in 1940. Creativity amid despair, strength within chaos, and the courage to turn fear into power. A year later, that flying brick would truly take flight, and the whole world would pay the price for daring to laugh at it. April 1943. The first P-47 Thunderbolts were deployed in Europe, symbols of American hope, but also the beginning of a string of humiliations no one wanted to remember. Over the skies of France, young pilots of the U.S. Army Air Force's boys, barely in their 20s, leaving behind homes in Kansas or Texas, were struggling to control a steel monster weighing nearly 10 tons. The P-47 flew slowly, heavily, and when it tried to climb, it gasped for breath before the German enemy. Over the radio, a Luftwaffe pilot sneered. "It flies like a truck, turns like a train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." They called those Americans milk cow pilots, a nickname both mocking and deeply humiliating. The first encounters were disasters. The P-47 couldn't catch up with the Tu-190. In every dogfight, before they could even fire, American pilots would see the enemy vanish from sight. The radios were filled with panicked shouts. "They're above us, they're above us." Then silence. At field bases across England, the pilots returned with empty eyes. They had lost their comrades and their faith in the aircraft that was promised to be the pride of American industry. They removed their flight helmets and threw them to the ground. One muttered quietly, "We're flying iron coffins, not airplanes." The European press laughed. German officers mocked. Thunderbolt? They should call it Thundercow. The skies of Europe belonged to them, the Luftwaffe, Hitler's hawks, soaring freely, while the Americans were like chicks, learning to fly amid storms of bullets. It was the most humiliating, wounded period in the history of the U.S. Air Force. A nation once confident in its technology now had to swallow the bitter truth, watching its aircraft torn apart within minutes of combat. But amid the charred wreckage, something began to rise. They started to realize the P-47 had one thing the enemy didn't. It refused to die. One Thunderbolt returned to base with 200 bullet holes across its fuselage. Another landed with only part of its wing intact, oil leaking, and frame broken. It survived, and that was what made the engineers, the pilots, and the factory workers back in America refuse to give up. The early failures of the P-47 didn't break the Americans, they enraged them. They didn't want to be called milk cow pilots. They didn't want to be seen as guests bringing technology to a war they didn't understand, a war of blood and iron. And so, groups of pilots began retraining themselves. They flew higher, faster, learning to exploit the Thunderbolt's one true advantage: weight and firepower. When the P-47 couldn't turn like the German planes, they stopped turning. When it couldn't climb, they dove. America's quiet fury began to forge itself in the skies over England, in every roar of the double Wasp engine, in every shriek of wind as they practiced steep dive attacks. Those once mocked as milk cow pilots began to understand they didn't need to fly beautifully like the Germans. They only needed to survive and shoot accurately. From collective humiliation, they found a faint spark of defiance. A spark that would soon ignite into flame, a fire that would burn the Luftwaffe to ashes. That was when the Americans finally understood. Being laughed at is not failure. True failure is when you stop fighting. June 1943. The skies over France burned like a furnace. Low clouds, strong winds, and the roar of Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engines tore through the stillness of the air. In the cockpit of P-47 Thunderbolt, no HVP, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was preparing for a mission to escort B-17 bombers back to England. He did not know that within minutes he would enter history alone against an entire pack of Luftwaffe wolves. The battle began at more than 25,000 feet, when the formation of P-47 seconds was split apart. From the direction of the sun, 190 seconds dove down like deadly arrows. A burst of 20mm shells ripped through Johnson's plane. Rounds tore into the fuel tank, shattered the cockpit glass, and blood spread across the instrument panel. He tried to pull the control stick, but the Thunderbolt no longer responded. It was on fire. Through the smoke, Johnson saw an FTA-190 closing in, only a few dozen meters away. The German pilot looked up, realizing his opponent had not bailed out. He squinted and squeezed the trigger. Another burst of gunfire. The canopy exploded. Johnson's head slammed into the steel frame, blood soaking his flight suit. The P-47 lurched and began to fall. In that fleeting moment between life and death, Johnson later recalled, "I heard the wind whistling through the bullet holes. It felt like the beast was groaning, but it refused to die." He pulled the stick once, twice, 3 times, and then the miracle happened. The 10-ton steel monster slowly leveled out. The flames faded, the engine coughed, but it was still breathing. Johnson's P-47 now had more than 200 bullet holes. Its right wing was nearly shredded. But he was still alive. And that beast, though tortured to its limits, would not surrender. Johnson decided to turn back toward England. But before he could gain altitude, he spotted another FW-190 tailing him. The German pilot, Lieutenant Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most famous aces, couldn't believe his enemy was still in the air. He closed in and emptied the rest of his ammunition. Tracer rounds flashed around Johnson, piercing the wings, the tail, and even the armored plating. But the Thunderbolt kept flying. Out of ammunition, Egon Meyer slowed down, flying parallel to Johnson. In that moment, the two men looked straight at each other through the cracked glass. No more hatred, no more contempt, only sheer astonishment. The German pilot raised his hand in salute, then tilted his wing and flew away. Johnson, barely conscious, kept guiding the shredded steel beast back toward England. The P-47 landed in silence, skidding across the runway before coming to a halt amid the whistling wind. When the ground crew rushed over, they froze. No one could believe that something so destroyed had still managed to fly. From that day forward, Thunderbolt was no longer a joke. It became the symbol of impossible survival, a machine that could not be killed. News spread across Europe. German pilots called it Der Teufel aus Stahl, the devil of steel. Meanwhile, in America, newspapers printed Johnson's photo with the headline, "He flew through hell and came back smiling." But behind that legend lay a bloody lesson. The P-47 did not become great because of technology, but because of human will. In other hands, it was just a heavy block of steel. But in the hands of men like Johnson, it became the thunder god of freedom. That battle marked a transformation not only for one pilot, but for the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. From a force once mocked, they began to believe in the beast they commanded. And from the moment Robert Johnson brought that bullet-riddled P-47 back to base, America was no longer afraid to fly. That day, over the skies of France, the German laughter went silent. In its place remained only the roar of the double Wasp engine, heavy, fierce, echoing like thunder that heralded a new era. After months of defeat, the skies over Europe began to change color. From the ashes of failure, the Americans learned their most valuable lesson: never try to become someone else. The P-47 was not the graceful Spitfire, nor the agile Bf-109. It was a steel monster. And only when they accepted its true nature did the Americans realize they didn't need to chase, they only needed to dive. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces completely restructured their combat tactics. Pilots who had once been terrified now sat together in smoke-filled tents, sketching new attack paths across maps of the sky. They called it the boom and zoom tactic, a method as simple as it was brutal. Fly high, observe, then dive like a thunderclap. At nearly 900 kilometers per hour, 8 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns screamed each second, unleashing hundreds of armor-piercing rounds. No finesse required, no turning duels, just one decisive strike. American wings no longer avoided combat. they hunted the Luftwaffe. When 190 seconds circled for prey, from above, the P-47 seconds plunged straight down, hammering their backs with a storm of lead, and when the dive was complete, the Thunderbolt pulled up like a bullet, leaving behind smoking wrecks of German planes. No longer milk cow pilots. No longer the ones being laughed at. Now, they were the hunters. A German pilot later recalled, "We heard a shriek like lightning, then a burst of 50 cal rounds tore through the cockpit. When I looked up, I saw only a giant black shadow disappearing into the clouds." In those days, the P-47 earned a new nickname, Donnerschlag, the thunderclap of God. Wherever it appeared, the Luftwaffe retreated. The Americans didn't just change the way they fought, they changed their spirit. From fear, they turned to initiative. From defense, they became the ones setting the rules. Before every takeoff, the pilots said only one sentence to each other, "No one laughs at us anymore." The skies of Europe were no longer a place where Americans learned to survive. They had become the stage where they proved their strength. Each battle, each dive, each fallen foe 190 crashing to the ground was an answer to the laughter of the past. They no longer needed words, because from that moment on, the Thunderbolt had begun to roar with the voice of freedom. When the tactics had taken shape, America began to do what no other nation in the world could replicate, turning war into an industrial assembly line. By mid-1944, across the states from Farmingdale, New York to Evansville, Indiana, thousands of factories blazed with light through the night. The sounds of hammers, lathes, and clashing metal merged into a symphony of power. The men might have been fighting on the front lines, but it was here in the scorching factories that the P-47 empire was truly born. Every 63 minutes, one Thunderbolt rolled off the assembly line. Not a miracle, but the strength of millions of hands. American women, mothers, wives, workers wearing headscarves and coveralls took the places of men in the factories. They didn't hold rifles, but they forged the weapons of freedom. On each fuselage, written in red paint, were the words, "Made by Rosie," a symbol of industrial pride and national spirit. The P-47 kept evolving. From the B and C models to the P-47D-22, equipped with a 13-foot paddle blade propeller that boosted climb rate by 50%. Engineers added auxiliary fuel tanks, extending its range by more than 1,000 miles, enough to escort the B-17 and B-24 flying fortresses deep into German territory. Now, the skies over Europe had no room left for the Luftwaffe. Within every roar of the double Wasp engine lived the soul of an entire nation. It was more than machinery, it was a declaration that freedom could be mass-produced, that human strength could be multiplied through intellect and discipline. By March 1944, German soldiers had begun whispering a new name for the Thunderbolt. Donnerschlag, the thunderclap of God. They said that the moment they heard that unmistakable roar in the distance, they already knew everything was about to turn to ash. And while Europe burned in chaos, America shone like a colossal steel furnace. Freight trains carrying P-47 parts ran day and night, while young engineers refined every tiny detail to add a few more miles of speed, a few more minutes of range. Not a single minute passed in which America was not producing for victory. If the Luftwaffe had once been the symbol of German engineering, then the Thunderbolt had become the symbol of American will, rugged, practical, enduring, and unstoppable. Each P-47 was not just a fighter plane, it was a statement. When an entire nation rises together, there is no sky they cannot command. The 6th of June, 1944. A cold, dim dawn rose over the English Channel. Mist drifted like gunsmoke, and beneath the lead-grey waters, thousands of Allied warships roared toward the beaches of Normandy. Above them, the Pratt and Whitney double Wasp engines of hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts thundered like the voice of heaven announcing humanity's fateful hour. It was not only the largest amphibious invasion in history, but also the day the P-47 was born a second time, no longer a mere escort fighter, but the god of thunder on the battlefield. From early morning, more than 500 Thunderbolts took off from bases in England. Their mission, to tear apart everything that stood between the Allied armies and the soil of France. Fields, convoys, bunkers, fortresses all lay within the sights of the flying brick. At altitudes so low, the pilots could see the faces of soldiers below. The P-47 seconds dove like lightning bolts. 8 Browning. 50 caliber machine guns screamed, weaving fiery lines that shredded trenches and annihilated panicked German armor columns. One pilot recalled, "We flew so low we could feel the heat rising from the explosions. Every time we fired, the whole plane shook like a roaring beast." On that fateful day, sky and earth became one. The P-47 was both the eye and the iron fist of the Allied forces. Any Wehrmacht convoy spotted was obliterated within seconds. 10 seconds and a convoy turned into a sea of fire. In the first month after D-Day alone, the Thunderbolt destroyed 651 locomotives, 3,800 trucks, 500 tanks, and thousands of tons of German supplies. On every road, wherever charred wrecks lay scattered, people would say, "The Thunderbolt has been here." But that victory was written not only in steel and fire, but in blood. Many American pilots never returned. Some P-47 seconds dove too low, caught flak fragments, or were hit by anti-aircraft fire erupting in flames under the morning light. Yet none wavered. They knew if they didn't destroy Germany's supply lines, the soldiers on Omaha and Utah beaches wouldn't survive past noon. A Normandy eyewitness later wrote in his diary, "Above us, huge planes like iron bison, their engines pounding in our chests. When they passed overhead, I knew. The sky belonged to us." The P-47 was no longer the laughingstock of 1,943. It was the shield of freedom, the sword of D-Day. Every roar of its engine was a declaration that America had arrived and would not stop until Europe was free. After Normandy, the Thunderbolts pushed deeper into France, Belgium, and then Germany. From the skies they rained fire upon retreating armies, severing the lifelines of the Third Reich. German soldiers gave them a fearsome name, Jabos demons from the sky. One German soldier later recounted, "They came so low I could see their faces. Then my entire convoy went up in flames within 10 seconds. No one even had time to scream." D-Day was not only a triumph of strategy, but a triumph of the human spirit. Those once mocked had become gods of the sky. And from that day forward, wherever the Thunderbolt flew, it carried a single message. Freedom is coming, and it has wings of steel. In 1944, as Europe still burned amid the smoke and fire of war, America reached the peak of a steel storm, a moment when technology, manpower, and willpower merged as one. No longer a nation standing on the sidelines, the United States had become the heart of victory, where every beat of its vast industrial power resonated with the wings of the P-47 Thunderbolt. While the Luftwaffe was slowly drained of fuel and pilots, across the Atlantic the assembly lines of Republic Aviation and Curtiss Wright roared without rest. From New York to Indiana, the lights of the factories never went out because every 60 minutes a new Thunderbolt was born. 15,683 P-47 seconds were built, a staggering number unmatched by any nation in the war. Each one contained 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of wiring, and the result of thousands of hours of labor by people who had never once set foot on the battlefield. The workers, engineers, and especially the American women, the icons of Rosie the Riveter, had turned factories into front lines and hammers and pliers into weapons. They never fired a gun, but they forged the wings of freedom. The P-47 wasn't just produced in massive numbers, it got better every single day. Each month, Republic engineers introduced improvements: stronger engines, better armored cockpits, longer range. The P-47D variant became a true nightmare in the sky, capable of escorting B-17 seconds all the way to Berlin, then swooping down to devastate ground targets. In the air, it shot down Messerschmitts. On the ground, it burned tanks. Wherever the roar of the double Wasp engine was heard, the Germans knew that America's god of thunder was coming. Meanwhile, the contrast between two worlds became painfully clear. Nazi Germany, once proud of its technological superiority, now struggled with a few hundred remaining fighters short on fuel, short on pilots, and short on faith. America, with boundless resources and an unbreakable spirit, was building planes faster than the enemy could shoot them down. American pilots received an average of 400 flight hours of training, while Luftwaffe pilots barely reached 100. On one side stood a weary force struggling to survive. On the other, a new generation full of confidence, flying the P-47 as if it were an extension of their own bodies. They knew they were representing the strength of a nation that could not be defeated. By now, the P-47 was no longer just the symbol of an aircraft. It was the symbol of industrial civilization, of freedom mass-produced, and of American pride. When America decides to fight, it doesn't just send its people, it sends its entire industry with them. 1945. Over the skies of Germany, the roar of the Thunderbolt was no longer the sound of battle but the requiem of a dying empire. The Germans gave it a strange name: Roosevelt's piano. They said that every time they heard the thunder of 50-caliber bullets from its 8 Browning machine guns, it felt as if the entire sky was playing the symphony of death. By then, the Luftwaffe was only a shadow of itself. German pilots suffered from a terrifying condition known as jabo fever, the invisible dread of those P-47 seconds diving out of the clouds. They said that at the faintest sound of a double Wasp engine in the distance, entire formations scattered. No one dared look up, no one dared speak. The flying milk cows once mocked by all had now become Europe's nightmare. The final numbers were almost unbelievable. 3,752 German aircraft shot down in the air, 3,315 more destroyed on the ground, 86,000 railcars, 6,000 tanks, and 68,000 trucks wiped from the map of war. No other Allied aircraft achieved such staggering destruction, and nothing in the Luftwaffe could stand against it. Yet amid the cheers of victory, there remained a note of sorrow. Every time a P-47 dove, another piece of land was left in ruins. Every performance of Roosevelt's piano, however triumphant, was composed from the sounds of steel striking bone, of smoke and tears. And that was precisely what made the Thunderbolt's triumph both magnificent and tragic. It did not merely destroy the Luftwaffe, it buried the legend of Nazi supremacy and wrote the final chapter of an age where man dared to fuse steel and will into one. We laughed when we first saw them, and died when they came back. A German pilot, 1945, 40 years after the war. Arizona, 1985. In a small hall filled with silver-haired veterans, those who were once enemies now sat across from each other, no longer pilots, but old men carrying the heavy memories of an entire generation. In the still air, a microphone crackled to life. A German man stood up, General Adolf Galland, a legend of the Luftwaffe, once commander of thousands of missions, now spoke slowly, his voice hoarse and gravelly, each word falling like the toll of a bell. We laughed, because we didn't understand. They didn't build a European-style fighter. They built something that fit America, powerful, durable, and endlessly producible. The room fell completely silent. The former American pilots, those who once flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, could only bow their heads, not out of pride, but out of respect. For them, it was no longer a victory of one side over the other, but a victory of humanity over fear, of endurance over destruction. Galland paused, looked toward his former enemies, now friends, and smiled. The P-47 was not just a weapon, it was the symbol of an era. A time when engineers, workers, and pilots all fought together. That sentence closed the circle of history. Those who once mocked it now bowed in recognition. And in that moment, the thunder of the Thunderbolt seemed to echo once more, no longer smelling of gunpowder, but resonating with the sound of reconciliation. 40 years later, the men who once chased and shot at each other in the skies now sat at the same table, raising their glasses, sharing old stories with laughter. The war had ended, but the reverence remained. Because in the end, they all understood one thing. True strength does not lie in technology or weaponry, but in the human spirit, the courage to believe, to endure, and to fly through hell and come back. As the gun smoke faded and Europe's fields bloomed once more, the final thunder of war still echoed. It was not the explosion of bombs, but the voice of freedom. The voice of those once mocked and underestimated, who had turned steel, oil, and willpower into a grand symphony called Thunderbolt. From the flying brick, the P-47 became a legend of steel. It proved that greatness does not come from beauty, but from the ability to rise after being scorned. Every roar of the double Wasp engine was an answer to the laughter of 1943. And as the 50 caliber rounds thundered across the sky, the world understood. When freedom speaks, no empire is mighty enough to silence it. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not merely a machine of war. It was the symbol of the human will to surpass its own limits. A testament to the strength of a nation that knew how to turn failure into drive and wounded pride into inexhaustible power. Those who flew it, those who designed it, and those who welded every piece of its steel all together wrote a heroic chapter of humanity. Now, looking back, one no longer hears the sound of guns but the echo of spirit, an echo that says, "Never fear being laughed at, let your thunder speak for itself." The thunder spoke the thunder had spoken. It did not echo only in war, but in every heart that dared to believe, to act, and to persevere. Because sometimes history is not written in ink, but carved into the roar of freedom. And that is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt,